Romantic pessimism, the last great event in the destiny of our civilization. In a paragraph entitled What is Romanticism? From the work The Joyful Science, Nietzsche admits to having made a mistake. The mistake is his initial misunderstanding of the Romanticism of the 19th century. It is obvious that I then misunderstood what constitutes the veritable character both of philosophical pessimism and of German music, namely their romanticism. What kind of misunderstanding? Nietzsche was wrong about the source of the European Romantic movement of the 19th century. He assumed Romanticism was born from a place of abundance, luxury, power, when in fact the opposite was the case. Romanticism was not a sign of strength, but of weakness. Let's explore his self-admitted mistake in more detail. The paragraph opens up with the question, what is Romanticism? But really, Nietzsche is talking about two aspects of this cultural movement, philosophical pessimism and German music. The two subjects of the paragraph can be boiled down even further. Philosophical pessimism is exemplified by the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, and German music is exemplified by the music of Richard Wagner. These two individuals encapsulate the Romantic spirit. Nietzsche mischaracterized the culture that gave rise to the philosophical pessimism of the 19th century. The tragic view of things seemed to me the peculiar luxury of our culture, its most precious, noble, and dangerous mode of prodigality. But, nonetheless, in view of its overflowing wealth, a justifiable luxury. In the same way, he mischaracterized the origins of Wagnerian music. I interpreted for myself German music as the expression of a Dionysian power in the German soul. I thought I heard it in the earthquake by means of which a primeval force that had been imprisoned for ages was finally finding vent. We come to the meat of the matter. Nietzsche thought that after the 18th century, which was exemplified by a strict rationality and elaborate systems of thought, we think of the philosophies of Kant, Spinoza, and Locke as main examples. The 19th century era Romanticism was the unleashing of that pent-up energy which the culture had accumulated during the Age of Reason, a new triumph of emotion and feeling over rationality and dry reason. Like the convict who is released from prison and immediately goes to the finest restaurants to splurge on food, Nietzsche interpreted the Romantic movement as a celebration of life for which European culture hungered after being starved of vitality in the century prior. However, this was wrong. Let's go back to the beginning. Every art and every philosophy may be regarded as a healing and helping appliance in the service of growing, struggling life. They always presuppose suffering and sufferers, but there are two kinds of sufferers. On the one hand, there are those who suffer from overflowing vitality, those who need Dionysian art. On the other hand, there are those who suffer from reduced vitality. Of these sufferers, there are two groups, those who need quietness, rest, calm seas, as Nietzsche puts it, and there are those who require the exact opposite, intoxication, ecstasy, madness. These two ways represent means of escaping from oneself, either through knowledge and contemplation, or through violent ecstatic art or intoxication. Fundamentally, those people in this latter category see life as a mistake. People in the first category, those who suffer from overflowing vitality, instead see life as a gift. All romanticism in art and knowledge responds to the twofold craving of the latter. To them, Schopenhauer as well as Wagner responded, and responds. to name those most celebrated and decided romanticists who were then misunderstood by me. By now, we can clearly see Nietzsche's mistake. He assumed Schopenhauer's philosophy and Wagner's music came from a place of overflowing vitality, when in fact, they were suffering from the opposite, reduced vitality. Why is this mistake important? The recognition of this error is important for a complete understanding of other typically Nietzschean concepts, such as degeneration, ressentiment, anti-life, anti-nature, and most important of all, Dionysian. From this point onward, the word Dionysian in Nietzsche's work comes to mean something completely different from in previous works, most notably The Birth of Tragedy. Dionysian, from here on out, refers to the overflowing vitality and a view of life that embraces suffering, not because suffering makes holy, as in Schopenhauer and in Christianity, but because suffering is a luxury, because suffering is justified in the face of the overflowing generative power of life itself. The being richest in overflowing vitality, the Dionysian god and man, may not only allow himself the spectacle of the horrible and the questionable, but even the fearful deed itself and all the luxury of destruction, disorganization, and negation. With him, evil, senselessness, and ugliness seem as it were licensed in consequence of the overflowing plenitude of procreative, fructifying power which can convert every desert into a luxuriant orchard. We will discuss the concept of the Dionysian in more detail in a follow-up video. Stay tuned. The being richest in overflowing vitality, the Dionysian god and man, may not only allow himself the spectacle of the horrible and questionable, but even the fearful deed itself and all the luxury of destruction, disorganization, and negation. With him, evil, senselessness, and ugliness seem as it were licensed in consequence of the overflowing plenitude of procreative, fructifying power, which can convert every desert into a luxuriant orchard. This video is part 2 on our discussion on Nietzsche's mistake. Watch part 1 by clicking the link below. In that video, we went over what Nietzsche calls his mistake concerning the Romantic era and what that means for art and culture. Nietzsche assumed Wagnerian music and Schopenhauerian philosophy were the products of an overflowing vitality or a surplus of life. However, in The Joyful Science, he changes his mind. It was a mistake to think Wagner and Schopenhauer are a product of exuberance. Rather, Wagner and Schopenhauer are the product of a lack of vitality. Wagnerian art and Schopenhauerian philosophy thus represent the tyrannical will of a sorely suffering, struggling, or tortured being who would like to stamp his most personal, individual, and narrow characteristics, the very idiosyncrasy of his suffering, as an obligatory law and constraint on others, who, as it were, takes revenge on all things in that he imprints, enforces, and brands his image, the image of his torture, upon them. The late Nietzsche is of course vehemently opposed to art of this kind. Most notably in his work The Case of Wagner, we find a long polemic that seeks to critique Wagner's music and with it Schopenhauer's philosophy. If there is enough interest, we might do a separate video on Nietzsche versus Wagner. Comment below if you're interested. But this video is not about criticism. In this follow-up video, we want to take a look at what kind of art this late Nietzsche considers good. If bad art proceeds from a lack of vitality, what kind of art proceeds from a surplus of vitality? In the paragraph of The Joyful Science in question, Nietzsche drops 4 names. Art may proceed from gratitude and love. Art of this origin will always be an art of apotheosis, perhaps dithyrambic, as with Rubens, mocking divinely, as with Hafitz, or clear and kind-hearted, as with Goethe, and spreading a Homeric brightness and glory over everything. Notably, Nietzsche names 1 painter and 3 poets, but not a single musician. If we take a quick look at Nietzsche's writings in his unfinished book The Will to Power, we read the following. Homer as an apotheosis artist. Rubens also. Music has not yet had such an artist. However, we can reasonably conclude, when we read Nietzsche contra Wagner, that the musician who comes closest to this Dionysian ideal of the late Nietzsche would be Georges Bizet with his opera Carmen as his magnum opus. All these artists mentioned by Nietzsche have works that stress vitality, dynamism, and an overflowing of life. Let's look at the Encyclopedia Britannica entry for Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens is the greatest exponent of Baroque painting's dynamism, vitality, and sensuous exuberance. Concerning the works of Goethe and Hafiz, a Persian poet and theologian, Nietzsche wrote, "Finally, even the complaisant and wanton surrender to the emotions, as has been taught by Hafiz and Goethe, the bold letting go of the reins, the spiritual and corporal licentia morum in the exceptional cases of wise old codgers and drunkards, with whom it no longer has much danger." Nietzsche is looking for art that was created out of gratitude for life, not hatred. Art that recognizes human emotions and isn't afraid to let them take the upper hand. Art that, in Nietzsche's words, spreads a Homeric brightness over everything. There is a passage in The Joyful Science in which Nietzsche is speaking about so-called Homeric happiness. But really, the passage shows how we might think of this new kind of art which is envisioned by Nietzsche. To have fine senses and a fine taste, to be accustomed to the select and the intellectually best as our proper and readiest fare, to be blessed with a strong, bold and daring soul, to go through life with a quiet eye and a firm step, ever ready for the worst as for a festival and full of longing for undiscovered worlds and seas, men and gods. To listen to all joyous music, as if there perhaps brave men, soldiers and seafarers took a brief repose and enjoyment, and in the profoundest pleasure of the moment were overcome with tears and the whole purple melancholy of happiness. Who would not like all this to be his possession, his condition? It was the happiness of Homer, the condition of him who invented the gods for the Greeks, nay, who invented his gods for himself. But let us not conceal the fact that with this happiness of Homer in one's soul, one is more liable to suffering than any other creature under the sun. And only at this price do we purchase the most precious pearl that the waves of existence have hitherto washed ashore. It would be impossible to look at poems by Hafiz, literature by Goethe, paintings by Rubens, epics by Homer, and music by Bizet in any kind of detail in a video like this. Rather, we hope this video serves as inspiration. We hope you want to explore these artists with this knowledge in mind. And even if we could do a deep dive into art history and Nietzschean aesthetics, there is the main problem that Nietzsche himself doesn't really know what to expect. He is primarily talking about art from the future. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche presented his vision for a philosophy of the future. But that's just what it was, his vision, the first step. Nietzsche did not live long enough to complete the task, and you could say it is up to us to finish it. The same goes for so-called Dionysian art. It was to be an artwork of the future. In the sketches of his planned book, The Will to Power, we can find some hints and bits and pieces as to what Nietzsche was getting at, but his aesthetics in this sense have never been fully systematized. Of course, we do know that the Dionysian doesn't like order, definiteness, or calculation. The Dionysian is free, light, overflowing, living, chaos. Uncharted territory waiting to be explored. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.